How can you create a beautiful garden that is kind to the earth and provides shelter for wildlife and food for us? Travis Philp of Greenshire Eco Farms tells us how to use the design principles of permaculture to do just that. Welcome to Richter's Seminars. This video presentation is from a series of free educational seminars on herb and garden topics offered each year at Richter's.
So no-till farming or gardening is very much in line with permaculture because it seeks to sort of mimic nature in terms of, a forest or a field doesn't need to till itself to be able to grow. I mean, there are certain, mudslide events and that do happen that it would be similar to tilling, but for the most part, soils in nature are a stable system that are sort of self-regulating, and basically the microorganisms, the worms mainly, do a lot of the tilling in a natural system. With a no-till, your soil tends to get better and better every year, whereas with a tilling system, it's either going to kind of stay the same or generally it gets worse. And so permaculture is always trying to regenerate an ecosystem and build the fertility. It's a method of gardening that you don't flip or dig or till or plow the soil. And why would you not want to do that? Well, tilling causes compaction and it destroys the soil structure, and that really hinders the growth of plants and their ability to spread roots and do what they need to do to grow healthy. And in terms of the soil structure, every time you till, the problem is that at the particle level, the particles are going from a coarse sort of nook and cranny kind of configuration to going more spherical, and the importance of those little spaces, they're called pore spaces, is that they hold air and water for storage for the plants to use. And so if you have all these spheres, they kind of butt up right against each other and don't allow for enough of that air and water penetration. Every time you till, the problem is that you lose about 30% of your organic matter. It just goes up into the air, and or when a weather event comes along, like a wind or rain, it can cause erosion of the soil just by carrying it down slope. There's actually been some states that, at least one state, that had to ban tilling because they lost too much topsoil. Tilling over time requires a lot more fertility inputs than no-tilling in general. And as I said before, it does cause a lot more soil loss than a no-till system. It can carry a lot of the soil away. There are the famous example of that was the Dust Bowl in the 1920s, I think, in the States. And there are some states that have actually had to ban tilling because they've lost so much topsoil due to tillage. So why would you want to go to no-till? It's sort of an all-heal for depleted soils. It can really revitalize even the worst soils. You can even do it over top of concrete. I was talking to a guy who did a community garden in a basketball court that was run down, and they grew on top of the basketball court. It's amazing at giving you a sort of soil ecosystem where you have all these beneficial microbes and bacteria and fungi and insects that are fostered by most no-till systems. I just want to check something because I'm only seeing, I think, half the slide. Oh, I'm attached to that. Can you see hugelculture on the bottom there? Okay, okay. The methods I'm going to cover are ramial chip branchwood, and I'll go into much detail about these. Hay, straw bale garden, soil or compost bombing, or square foot gardening it's also called, sheet mulching, the Ruth Stout method, living mulch systems, and hugelculture. So basically, ramial chip branchwood, this is more on the industrial scale, not so applicable to most home gardeners unless you've got access to a wood chipper. So basically, tree limbs that are smaller than 3 inches in diameter are used. They're chipped up. They contain 3/4 of the vitality of the tree, and because you're using the smaller branches, they don't lock up the nutrients. They don't lock up the nitrogen, so there's not too much worry about that happening. Whereas if you're using the trunk, there's a lot of it's a higher carbon content, and basically the animals and whatnot, the microorganisms that break down the carbon have to use up a lot of the nitrogen in the area to do that. So that's when you get nutrient lockup. Doesn't happen with ramial chip branchwood as long as you do it right. You want to avoid cedars or conifer content that's a bit too high. You can use some, but there's either too much acidity, or in the case of cedar, there's growth inhibitors that are contained in the wood. Yes?
You can solve that problem if you just let that cedar sit for a year, not use it.
Oh, yeah.
And then a year later you can start to use it. It won't create a problem, but it will if you use it right away.
Oh, okay. So, someone's saying that if you can use cedar if you let it sit for a year and weather. Let's see. It's a good idea to add some forest soil or some good compost. Basically, sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself. You chip the wood, place it at least 2 inches thick, and then it is a good idea to add a little bit of forest soil into the mix if you can, but it's not necessary. So that's what you'll end up with. The sort of white stuff is the fungal growth. It's the mycelium, or the roots of the mushrooms, and they're really good because a lot of mushrooms or fungi will sort of sheath onto plant roots, and what is it? The mushrooms can't produce sugars, I believe. But the trees and plants can. So the trees will give the plants sugars, and the mushrooms will sort of, through their vast fungal network, will bring water to a plant or nutrients if the plant needs. Like I said, it's more of a large-scale farm thing. It's great at suppressing weeds. But if you have a good relationship or a good municipality, you talk to the folks that were doing the trimming, maybe they can tell you what they were trimming, and if it was more of the branch wood, then it could be used, and sometimes they'll even drop it off at your house. If it was used on a larger scale, it could foster the growth of a lot more woodlands, because you'd need a supply of wood, and so why not plant fast-growing trees like, let's say, poplars to use rather than cutting existing forests. So the problem is you got to wait a year in general, unless you till the wood in. The chippers are expensive. They do pollute into the air, and they do use gasoline. So that's kind of a drawback. And like I said, it's most urban and suburban folks don't have ready access to enough branch material to do a whole garden. It might be, good for a bed or two. And it does need to be reapplied every few years, whereas some of the methods that I'm going to talk about, it's sort of once, like hugelculture, which is the last one I'll talk about. If you build a bed properly, it could last your whole lifetime. And it does, like I said, it does take nutrients from the forest unless you're planting specifically to provide materials for this. So the next one is soil or compost bombing. It's where you take a thick layer of soil, usually 4 to 6 inches thick minimum, and you place it down on the pre-existing ground. This method was sort of made famous by the square foot gardening books. Can't remember the guy's name, but Mel Bartholomew had a great book on square foot gardening. And yeah, his method was with the sort of wooden 2x4s or something laid out in usually a 3 or 4 foot wide rectangle, and then you just fill that with compost and soil and that kind of thing. So that's what it can look like. Problem is a lot of organic matter is needed right off the bat. The moisture retention isn't quite as good as some of the other methods I'll go through, and the fertility might not last long unless you load it up right from the start. Okay, hay or straw bale gardens. It's where you take your bale and you just put it on the ground. Some people leave the twine, but I prefer to remove it unless I know that it's free of pesticides and that kind of thing. Or no, it's rodenticide. A lot of bale twine is treated with rodenticide so that mice aren't eating the twine, which is of course toxic to humans. So once you have the bale down in place, you put soil or a compost or a mix thereof on top of the bales at a minimum of 3 inches. The more the better, but your plants will be able to grow down into the bale with the roots. So it's really easy to do. As long as you can carry a hay bale, you can make these gardens. It requires very little, relatively, soil or compost. It does create a really high raised bed, and you can double stack these, so you could almost garden at a chest height. It's also really good if you're doing, if you're in a wheelchair and you want to garden. It creates a really warm microclimate. The beds, like we have some of these beds in our demo garden, and they tend to last at least a few days, if not a week or more longer at the end of the season, and they tend to warm up earlier in the season than a flat garden bed or even a slightly raised garden bed. And that's because the cold air tends to flow downwards into the paths and doesn't settle as much on top of the bale. But also the bale is slowly breaking down, so as it's breaking down, it's giving off heat. Yeah, you can, this is one of those methods that you can grow on top of any surface. You could grow on your floor if you had enough light. Problem is, it does require more watering than most of the other methods I'm going to talk about, especially in the first few weeks. But once the bale starts to get semi-broken down, it sort of catches up. I think that, I'm trying to think of how often we had to water ours. Once every 4 to 6 weeks, I think, which is pretty good. In a typical garden, you tend to have to water, once a week, once every 2 weeks or so. Some people find that the weed seeds will sprout from the bales. That can be an issue. I haven't had that happen too much, but I have seen it become a problem. But the weeds are generally easily removed or covered up. They're not well rooted, so they're sort of easy to pull out. And they don't, because they're not well rooted, they if you do weed them out, they're not going to kind of sprout back from the root. Yeah.
Do you put any soil on top of the bales?
Yep. You put a minimum, I think, 2 inches. Where was it? or yeah, 3 inches minimum. So you can, if you do build it up too high, you can get soil eroding off the sides. So if possible, it's good to have a retaining wall. What I do is I stacked 2 bales sort of in line next to each other, so it's about 3 feet wide of a bed. And I don't put soil right up to the edges. I leave a couple inches of bale on the edge of the garden so that it's not sliding right off the side. Let's see. Sheet mulching is the next one, and that's where you have various layers of organic matter piled on top of each other, usually alternating between nitrogen-rich and carbon-rich layers. Carbon-rich would be like straw or wood chips. Nitrogen-rich would be, you know, decomposing plant matter that's green still, or manure. You water each layer as you lay it down, and the more layers the better. The higher up you can get it, the more weed suppression you're going to have, and the longer the fertility will last. We've had beds that were, I think, well, going on 3 years now, and the only thing we add to them in terms of fertility is hay at the end of the year, and they haven't shown any nutrient loss yet. And I've heard of beds lasting much longer than that and not needing any new inputs. And part of that is the composting in place, and when you're harvesting, you want to leave as much of the plant in the bed or on the bed as possible. And that way it keeps the nutrients in place. So then the bed is either left to sit and decompose if you have the time, or if you need to get going right away, you kind of create these furrows or like little trenches or a little hole, and then backfill that with manure or sand or soil or a mix of that, and then you can plant right into it. So there are the layers there. So at the top you see the top mulch that keeps the sun off so that it's not baking your nutrients away and drying things out. And helps with weed suppression. And then you've got 1 to 2 inches of compost on there. This middle sandwich layer is a really important layer. That's sort of your long-term fertility and your really heavy weed suppression. So you've got 8 to 12 inches of mulch ideally. But you can get away with just doing the bottom 3 layers. So that's 2 layers of manure with some newspaper or cardboard in between, and then you would have a slight top mulch. You don't need the newspaper or cardboard. I've done some limited trials with this, so 2 beds side by side made exactly the same, one with cardboard, one without, and there was very little difference in terms of how many weeds came up. It was like the bed without the cardboard had like 1 or 2 handfuls more of weeds. It was very minimal. So I don't even use cardboard in these beds anymore. So I'm not sure how well it shows up on the screen there, but this is an example of a different style of sheet mulch that we did where, I can barely see it, we basically took leaf bags, and this was one of the first beds I made, just tore the leaf bag open, flattened it out, after watering the ground underneath, and then on top of that we put about 8 inches of tree leaves from the bags, and then on the left there we put I think it was 2 inches of half compost and half soil, and then finished it off with a top mulch of wood chips. And that's baby lettuce greens that we planted. And I'm not sure why this happened, but we had really good success with the greens. I'd like to think it was because of the style of bed that we use, but who knows. Generally, when you do baby cut lettuce greens, they'll last for maybe 3 harvests, and then they start to get bitter. And that's in a typically tilled and manured garden bed. At least that's my experience. So 2 to 3 harvests. But these beds, we were harvesting for 2 to 3 months. So every week we were harvesting. So we got about 8 harvests out of these before they started to go bitter. Again, I don't know if that was because of the method that we used to prepare the bed, but it was pretty neat to see. So there are some other examples. There you can see they've sort of created these pockets, these little holes, and backfilled them with soil, and then you just pop your transplant in as is. And then, I can't really point to it, but on the picture to the right, there's a picture of lettuce. So what they would have done was created a 1 to 2 inch wide furrow right down to the pre-existing ground level. And then you backfill that, pack it down, and then you plant your seeds right in it.
Is the top bark or straw?
In these, I think it's straw or hay. But it doesn't really matter. Just any kind of organic matter that's going to block the sun will work. So it's really good fertility in terms of longevity. Can last for years, and I don't have first-hand experience, but I've heard it can last indefinitely. It can eliminate the need for composting as long as you do the composting in place. This is a method that you can do on top of any surface. It's really good at acting like a sponge and soaking up moisture. Generally, I have to water my beds that are this style every 2 months, I think. And I don't even think I need to water them. Yes? Well, generally, where is it? So this is the pinnacle. You don't have to do it this thick, but so you have 3 layers of manure with 1 to 2 layers of carbon. 2 to 3 layers of manure and 1 to 3 layers of carbon mixed in. If you look at, there's books on like lasagna gardening, I think it's also called. To do it without manure, you could add like plant waste, like plants that are still green, that still have a lot of the nutrients in. I would put that at the bottom.
Lawn clippings, bag your lawn clippings, they work fantastic.
Yeah, grass clippings are really good for that. I think though, I could be wrong on this, but I think you need at least a couple of weeks. If you're going to use just plant material, you need to let it sort of decompose for a couple of weeks to let the nutrients become available to your plants. I know that's the case with another method I'm going to talk about, where they're having like a living mulch system, it's called. So they're growing plants, mowing them back, waiting 2 weeks, and then planting into that. Any other question on it? Okay, where was I? Okay, I think I went through that. It is a good method for weed suppression, but watch out for your paths, because if the weeds take hold, they'll sort of, especially with grasses, they'll run roots that you can't see into your bed, because it's a amazing place for them, and then before you know it, you'll have grass sprouting up like everywhere. So take the cardboard and put it into your paths if you're going to use cardboard. Drawbacks. Well, it does require a relatively high amount of organic material to start off, but it's not as much as like the square foot gardening, and it's going to last you for probably years, and it is a lot more time to spend to make your garden, but you're going to save more time in the end compared to running a tiller through, and your arms aren't going to hurt like crazy using a tiller. And you won't have oil and gas spewed into your garden. So let's see, the Ruth Stout method, or the sort of throwing hay on the ground kind of method. So yeah, she just, Ruth Stout was a lady that fortunately passed now, but she gardened quite a long time and gardened the conventional way at first, but then thought, this is silly, why am I doing this? And one year the farmer that she hired couldn't come in and till her plot for her. So she said, well, my asparagus doesn't need to be tilled. Why should I have to do that for the rest of my garden plants? So she got some hay delivered and just threw down hay on her garden bed and planted into that. My understanding is that she just sprinkles seeds into the hay, but she lives in, I think, New England or somewhere with a lot of frequent rainfall. So I think that's why she can get away with it. I've tried very limited trials with just sprinkling seeds into the hay. It didn't really work out so well. The germination rate wasn't good. Maybe if I was on there with a garden hose every other day, it might sprout, but I threw seeds down and just kind of left it. Which isn't to say it couldn't work for any of you. What I ended up doing was kind of hybridizing the sheet mulch and this method, where I would just dump hay on the ground, because I have lots of hay. I've got like 1,500 bales a year. A lot of them go rotten. So I'd dump hay on the ground about that thick, and then I would create those furrows to expose the bare ground below. Sometimes I would backfill the furrow and then plant my seeds into that. Yes?
Is the hay dried first, or is it after you just freshly cut it?
It could be either or. I think it's ideal to let it rot for a bit first, because it can get pretty hot and it might burn seeds or seedlings. Mike, you cringed there.
I was just wondering, are you using hay or are you using straw?
Hay.
Hay's got a lot of weeds.
What's that?
I mean, hay's got an awful lot of weeds because it's basically a pasture thing.
Yeah, he's saying that hay does have a lot of weeds. In my experience, not a lot comes up though, for whatever reason.
Mostly getting enough heat to kill them, I guess.
Yeah, there might be enough, like he's saying, there might be enough heat to kill the weed seeds. Yes?
I recently was looking into that and the difference between the straw and the hay. So I think depending on the application, if I was using it for my chickens and they were saying straw is better because it's hollow and it doesn't grab the moisture.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking for like this, you want it to hold moisture. So then I'm thinking hay is better maybe than straw. I don't know.
Could
Tell
be.
me what they said the difference most of the time.
Yeah. Sorry? You could mix it, yeah, I would think, yeah. I've used that on a more of a mulch, like limited scale, where in our tractor paths, we would hack down the grass that was just growing there, and we've used that. But that was on a garden that was already well established. I have seen straw sprout, like straw bales sprout lots of weeds as well. Yeah, so it can happen with either. What was I going to say? If you get a lot of sprouting happening in this method, what I've done is I've just flipped the hay over on itself, and that quickly deals with the problem. And that kind of creates a little bit of a green manure, because those little sprouts will die off and then bleed their nutrients for your plants to use. What was I going to say about this? Oh yes, and so she never weeded, Ruth. She didn't like to bend down and fuss with that. So she would just walk around her garden with a handful of hay and just kind of throw it on top of any weeds. Now that can be a problem with tiny seedlings. So you kind of have to wait until they're mature enough that you're not going to bury them, or get in there with some, sort of a fine-tooth comb type of attitude and just make sure you don't cover up your seedlings. You can either go about it by planting your plants really thickly and close together, so that their canopies close in on each other quickly and doesn't allow any space for many weeds to come up through. Or you can plant your plants very far apart so that you can come in with a big ton of hay and dump it on the spaces in between. So there's Ruth in all her glory. Squash is a good one to grow in the first year. If it grows thick enough, as you can see, it doesn't let a lot of space for light to penetrate through and for weeds to come up. And you can grow any crop in these, even nitrogen-hungry corn. So it's really easy to set up. You can just roll a bale out or just throw a bunch of mulch on the ground. It's very time efficient, and it's very easy on the body. Ruth was doing this, till her death. She was like, I think, late 80s she was gardening. And problem is, for at least dropping the seeds into the ground, you need a wet climate or a constant sprinkler. It's kind of hard to get used to this whole idea. It's sort of counterintuitive. Ruth had, as I said, gardened conventionally for a lot of years on her space before she switched to this method, so her garden was well manured for many years. But I've done it on top of grass, and it did work out okay. It wasn't great, but it did work out okay, and over the last 2 years it has improved in terms of fertility. Doesn't look that great to the conventional eye, but I think it looks pretty awesome myself, but I know I'm on the fringe of that. It does require a lot of organic matter in the way of hay or grass or that kind of thing every year, but even if you live in suburbia, you could go around and make deals with your neighbors, trade vegetables for grass clippings, and get them to bring them over, let them kind of decompose for a bit, and when they get brown, then you could throw it on if you're worried about nitrogen. Yeah?
What we do is we drive around in the town at night, in the fall, and take bags of leaves.
Yeah.
We don't have enough, so we...
You want recycling night?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so go...
we know the neighborhood, so they're mostly maple trees.
Go leaf bag hunting. I do that myself. Yeah, I've got a minivan that I've taken the seats out of, and when it's time, I go around on garbage night and got all the mulch I need for the year, pretty much. And yeah, you can use tree leaves for this too. It'd be ideal to run your lawnmower over them to shred them first, but that's not necessary. Okay, living mulch systems was it's been going on for probably since we started agriculture, but recently it was pioneered. It started in the 1930s. Pioneered by Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote the One Straw Revolution, was a pretty amazing book on natural gardening, natural farming. So essentially you're creating a perennial ground cover, usually of white clover, dwarf white clover, and that is your main nutrient provider and weed suppressor. If you plant it thickly enough, early enough in the year, it's going to come up and not allow any room for any other plant to grow. So essentially you clear the land. This might require a one-time tilling, but it won't need to be done again. The ground cover is planted. Prior to planting your crop, you mow the crop, as I said before. You mow the ground cover and then wait at least 2 weeks for the nutrients to become available. Rows are chiseled into the, like your planting rows are chiseled with either a tractor or a pickaxe or a hoe. Fukuoka would take a pickaxe and he'd be bending down there with the axe going in his long rows, but a hoe will work as well. And for transplants, you just dig a shallow hole and plant into that. There are also crimpers that it's a slightly altered method. Well, I guess that's going back to the mowing. A crimper won't kill a plant. Like say I didn't want to use clover for whatever reason. You can grow a grass and run a crimper across it, and it breaks the plant in 2 or 3 places, knocks it over, and then you can go in with either a seed drill or a shovel and plant your plants into the broken mulch. The ground cover is mowed when it starts to get out of control, and the clippings are raked next to the crop usually to add some mulch. So here you have, sorry, I've got a lot of glare on the screen here. I need to kind of tilt it. So in the middle is peppers, surrounded by clovers, wildflowers on the bottom, I think, and I can't see that at the top there. Anyone know that plant at the top? Yeah, anyways, you can see that it's a mix of plants, and there's no bare space is the main point that picture is trying to get across. So there is a cole crop that you can see after the mowing. The benefits are that there are no dead areas. Everything is alive and green. It does help reduce a lot of plant pest issues and sickness issues. There's a woman in the States, Helen Attow. She has a website that details her trials for the last, I think, 30 years using these methods. And she found a 70% reduction in, what is that, the rot, sorry, I'm blanking on, it's a type of plant rot, the fusarium wilt, 70% reduction on fusarium wilt, I believe. And that was because of the no-till living mulch system that she was using. Helen Attow, A-T-T-O-W-E. Let's see, where am I here? It provides a lot of live habitat for beneficial organisms, especially pollinators. It can eliminate weeding if you get your ground cover in thick enough. I mean, you got to mow, but that's not too much of an issue. If you want to stay away from mowers, you can burn the ground next to your plants. There are, well, it's propane, but there are torches you can use. You can also just use a scythe or a sickle, which is what I use. So it's just those big Grim Reaper things, or the thing, what is it, the moon-shaped tool on the old Russian flag. And you go along and hack that, hack your mulch up with that. There's no need to replant your ground cover every year. There's no need to add mulch in the fall. And the soil does get better year after year with hardly any input from yourself, hardly any effort. And it can eventually eliminate the need to bring in off-site inputs. You may have to still add in some manure or some type of fertility into your actual furrow, that trench that you create. But eventually that will, or that should, as long as you've managed it well, not need to happen. You should be able to just rely on the green manure to bring your soil to a fertile state. Problem is that you do need to kind of wipe the slate clean of the land to start this off. In general, at least I've never heard of any other way to do it. The ground cover can kind of outcompete your crop if you don't manage it properly. I've seen like rows of lettuce where they didn't mow enough, and then the clover was able to sort of get into the lettuce row, and it was really hard to do any harvesting. And they can compete for nutrients if you're not keeping the ground cover under control. It can be problematic for hot weather crops because it raises the humidity. So if you're on say the west coast, and which is in certain parts of BC, like the Fraser Valley, they can't really grow. Oh no, sorry, I'm getting things crossed. But Helen did find that for her pepper and tomato crops, she had to lay down black plastic to sort of create a warm enough and microclimate and get rid of the humidity. I was trying to think of a way to get around black plastic. You could use, I don't know if it would be toxic now that I think of it, but galvanized steel. Does anyone know if that would be safe to use in a garden? Because you can get scraps of galvanized steel, you know, like the sheet metal roofing. And I look into that, but I think that would be an alternative to use. Where am I here? It doesn't really create a warmer microclimate. If anything, it's going to cool your soil down, so that is a bit of a drawback. Another way to get around that might be to create raised beds first, so that you have, the cold air goes into the path, and the more mass you have in your bed, the more heat it can hold. And it is energy intensive to create the rows, whether you're bending over with a pickaxe or using a tractor. There's a lot of energy that goes into that. And generally the rows are shifted every year, so if my row is here one year, I'm going to place it just adjacent to it the next year, so that I'm putting my row in that fertile spot. And the row that I had last year is sort of used up. The clover will grow into that row and then revitalize it. So hugelkultur, this is my favorite method. It's sort of the best all around, in my opinion. It was brought to the mainstream by Sepp Holzer out of Austria, but there's beds that were found in Germany that are like 800 years old, so this is an old method. It means hill culture or mound culture. You're basically just burying logs or brush or brassica stems and using that as your fertility and your water sponge. So it can eliminate the need for irrigation. If you use large enough diameter wood, Sepp says he doesn't have to water at all, and in some of my beds I've only had to water when we've had like 5 weeks, 6 weeks with no rain. It can eliminate the need for fertilizer. If you add enough wood into the bed, if it's a mix of old wood and new wood especially, and if you have a lot of branches on top of that, it can eliminate the need for any kind of fertility inputs beyond that. It does create a really warm microclimate, especially if you build it up really high. But also the act of the wood breaking down will sort of heat the bed and the air around it. And you can also sort of run your beds east-west so that you get a lot of sun exposure hitting the south side, and wind blocked from the north side, so you can get a really warm south-facing microclimate, and conversely a really cool north-facing microclimate. So that you can, on one bed, you could grow tomatoes on one side, spinach on the other, and have both do really well. You can shape the beds to make it so that you don't have to bend over to do any gardening. I think I have a picture on here about that, but basically our beds are about chest height for me, and the angle is almost a 45-degree angle, slightly less, but so I just have to kind of take a step, and I can garden like that. Let's see. Especially if you're in a limited amount of space, you can create more surface area for gardening than a flat ground would have. Yes?
Yeah, I was just, it works in our climate. I mean, we have like a really hot summer, and it's right, it's more like there and more hot.
It definitely does work in our climate.
So it's not burn, I mean, it's not burn the clothes?
It will be, if you build a 5-6 foot high bed, it will be a lot drier at the top. Generally, I have a path at the very, very top that's about 1.5 feet wide. So at the very top, it's reserved for path, and then I have like kind of sloped beds below. But you plan for that. So you grow something like garlic, which doesn't mind a bit of dry, or something that likes the heat, like a pepper, more up at the top half. And down at the bottom is where you would grow plants that like a little more water, a little cooler spot. You can grow these, or you can make these beds to look flush with the ground, to be flat. Dig a pit, throw your wood in there, and then just put the soil back to the same height as it was, and then you wouldn't have that problem at all. Yeah, there we go. So these are just a few different shapes you can work with. The top middle is more the shape that I've used. So at the very top is where the path is. My beds aren't quite so drastically sloped, but Sepp says that the soil should be, and he's been working with this since the 70s, and he's tried a lot of different methods. He says the best is to have the soil so it's almost going to erode. So you want that steep angle. Because what happens eventually is the bed will kind of cave in on itself as it decomposes. And he said that he found compaction was happening if he didn't have a very steep bed to start with. But you can have it more rounded. You can have retaining walls on the side by either using rocks or logs, and that will help stop, it will catch erosion. Someone's used hay bales instead of wood because they had that readily available. So they covered that with, plant matter of various sorts and then soil on top of that. So, how do you make it? Well, if you're digging a trench, and I must apologize, I think this is, oh no, it's complete. So, if you're going to dig a trench, you want to mark the trench, dig it to your desired depth. And again, the trench is not necessary. The trench is more, if you really are worried about holding water, trench will the trench will allow water to pool into it. And if you're short on a soil material for the top, the soil from the trench goes on the top. We lined our bed with cardboard because that helps foster mycelial growth. They really like to grow in cardboard, but again, that's not necessary. So depending on your desired depth and dimensions, the trench should be 1 to 5 foot deep. We actually took a backhoe and made about 4 foot deep trenches, but we've also dug them by hand and just dug down a shovel blade length. And then you want it to be at least 2 to 5 feet wide, bearing in mind that your bed is generally going to end up about 2 feet or more wider than your trench will be. So step 2, you would fill the trench. Oh geez. Sorry, this is an older version. I got this off my email just on the fly before the presentation, and it doesn't have a picture there, but I think the pictures start. Yeah, the pictures start from there on. This is the boring part, anyways. So you fill the trench with wood. Keep piling it as much as you can. Recommended a minimum height of 2 feet. Anything below that, you don't get a lot of the benefits of the beds. And it's recommended, like I said, Sepp used to build his beds about 2 to 4 feet high, but he found a 6 to 7 foot high bed lasts so much longer, and you don't have to water them, he says, and the microclimate is crazy. I mean, this guy's in Austria, which is, I think, a little colder than us. He's in the mountains, and he can grow citrus trees. He's growing lemon trees and some type of orange. And it's partly because of this bed, also because of a lot of rocks he uses, but this is part of that strategy to be able to grow citrus in a similar climate to ours. Let's see. So here's step 3. I'm 6 feet tall, so this was a bed we built by hand. So that gives you an idea of how high we built it. It was about a 45-degree angle, I think, that we built this bed on. It's a good idea to stomp the branches. I was up there just jumping around on it, getting all my frustrations out. And what that does is it helps eliminate these pits or pockets where soil can kind of sink into. Placing the sod on top of the branches also helps eliminate those pockets. That's the main way that you don't get a lot of sinkholes happening. So you flip it upside down so that it's harder for the grass to grow. Some of the grass will sprout up, but it's very weak when it does. And as long as you get on top of it right away, it won't become a problem, at least I've found. The sod also acts as sort of a slow-release fertilizer. As it breaks down, it will leach out its nutrients. And then if you want to, you can add hay or straw or leaves on top of there. And then as soon as you can, you want to plant it up with either a green manure or your intended crop. And that will further help stop any erosion and weeds from colonizing. And it's a good idea to mulch the surrounding paths so that you don't have anything creeping in from the sides and growing up the paths, because they will go right for your bed. And yeah, just have a ground cover there if possible, and then sit back and watch your plants go crazy once you've planted it in. So there's that picture I was talking about, so that you don't have to bend down. It's pretty steep, but it works quite well. Yes?
Did you water your bed, like you get like cloves or
Did I water it? Nope. Trying to think.
just put plants on the dry earth?
Well, no. When you're planting, you would want to water it. Yes.
But no one also, just when you finish your bed, no?
So I can barely hear you because of the rain. Sorry.
But you didn't watering the logs or the new bed?
Oh right. No. We didn't water as we constructed. No. In, It depends what you want out of the bed, and it depends on the location. So if you're on a steep slope, you would want your beds 45-degree angle against the slope. So let me see if I can. So if I'm looking at a hill, and that's your main slope there, you would want to build your beds like this, but then at a certain point you would want to switch like this, so that you, let me just modify that slightly, so that when you're thinking of water flow, if you have your water coming down, it's going to sort of collect in here and slowly percolate down, and then get caught by your bed here, and then come down this way, and then so on. Whereas if you had your beds running straight this way, as you get down lower, the beds down lower will be drier, because water gets stopped here, some percolates here, but a lot of it gets held, and as you go down, it gets drier. If you have your beds running straight down the hill, then the water is just going to flow in between them. Now, if you're talking about sun exposure, the best general sun exposure for all sides of the bed is to have them running north-south. If you want to create, if you want on one bed, if you want a sunny side and a sort of cool side, shaded side, then you would run them east-west. I think those are the main considerations. Wind is also a factor. If you've got a windy site, it's recommended ideally to have them running north-south, so that the bed on the west side, assuming you get a lot of westerly winds, the bed on the west side will sort of take the brunt of the wind, and then help sort of dissipate the direct flow of the wind. Yeah, I think that's all. Yes?
Do you have examples of things that you farm?
Yeah, we have the one that you saw, which is a hand-built one. It's about 3.5 feet tall. We have the ones that we've built with a backhoe and a tractor, and those are about, I think they've settled to be about 4.5 feet tall now. We have 7 of those that are 50 feet long. We have fruit trees actually planted into those. Really good for trees. Seth plants his on the path right next to the tree, so as soon as the the bed flattens out, he would plant the tree right there. If you plant them, and we planted ours on the bed about halfway up the side of the bed, and we found that they were kind of shifting a little too much for my liking. So they were kind of warping. As the bed breaks down, they have to sort of move along with the bed, and they don't settle very well. So putting it just adjacent to the bed, I think, is the best way to do it, because the roots can still go up into the bed, but it's on that stable ground.
What do you use for wood? Just like bits of sticks and whatever, or do you
Whatever
use,
you can get.
Do you use materials, say, from a vegetable garden, or that will break down too much?
No, all of the above. It's really what you can get your hands on. Ideally, you'd want to use, if you're thinking for long-term fertility, you'd want to use the densest wood possible and the newest wood. So like something like an oak or a maple would be ideal for, a bed that's going to last you 30 years before you have to do anything with it.
What about walnuts?
Walnut can be an issue. I've built 2 beds with a bit of walnut in. I'd say maybe 10% walnut, and they were fine. I grew onions, peppers, and eggplant in there. It's avoidable if you, I would say avoid it if you can, but use it if you have to. There's lists online of different plants that are juglone tolerant, juglone being the root exudation that inhibits the growth that walnut trees put out. If I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but if the walnut is decomposed long enough, like if it's an old log, I would imagine that, as with the cedar, there's not too much of that chemical in the log still.
Do you use actual logs, or would you use branches?
Ideally, it would be logs, because those are going to last longer. Yeah, the larger diameter, the better. The larger the diameter, the more water it's going to hold in general, and the longer it'll last. If you build a bed with just small sticks, it's probably going to last 1 to 3 years, I would imagine. I don't know for sure, because I always use a combination. Combination is the best. To have your logs on the bottom as your long-term water and nutrient storage, and then have sticks on top of that. The sticks will be able to be used by your plants in probably the first year, if not the second. Whereas the logs, if they're freshly cut live trees, they might take a year or 2 before their nutrients become available.
What do you do in the fall then? Do you take all the debris off and replenish it with more soil, or for next spring?
Generally, I leave the debris on to sort of, cover up the bed. But you could remove it if you're looking for more of an aesthetic. But it's better functionally to leave all plant matter on the bed. It'll also, especially if you're leaving root masses in the bed, it'll help hold the bed together.
And do you pile more on?
There's no need to pile any more wood on until the bed flattens out after a few years.
Any earth on top?
Well, the more earth on top of the wood, the better. So if you're finding that you're seeing some wood become exposed, or if you just came into a whole pile more soil somehow, then yeah, I'd say throw more on. You'd want a minimum of about 6 to 8 inches, but it's ideal to have 1 to 2 feet on top of your log. Yes?
What about wood chips and sawdust? Would that be?
Yeah, I don't know firsthand about that. I would imagine that with wood chips, you might get mold growing. I don't know for sure, but I think, like, I've seen a pile of wood chips under a tarp get moldy. I don't know, maybe the soil on top would breathe enough that it wouldn't be a problem. I was talking to someone who was worried about nitrogen lockup from that big amount of wood chips, because it would need, unless it was chipped branch wood, it would need a lot of nitrogen in that space to be able to break it down effectively. Any other questions on it?
Is there a good website on this method?
Well, there are several popping up. It's been a while since I've looked at any. Permies.com, Permies, has a page devoted to this. So I guess that would be, off the top of my head, the best one to go to. They have like a hugelkultur. They love, like, the guy that sort of runs that site loves this. It's and he did a write-up with a lot of the pictures I have are from that. If you look up, like, if you're on a search engine and you go to images, type in hugelkultur, you'll get a lot of different looks for that. For instance, here's one that I found that you would never know if no one told you that that's hugelkultur. And same with this one. Looks like a typical landscaped garden bed. So where was I with this? Any other questions on it? Yeah?
How did he use the rocks in order to help the microclimate?
Well, he had, I think there was a cliff face, like, trying to think, like a rock outcropping that was naturally there. And then he had, like, the hugelkultur bed, I think, below that. And then he had as big a stone as he can get, just puts it around the trunk of the tree. Yeah. So I kind of already went through most of this. The one line about it has the benefit of tilling without the drawbacks is, as the bed breaks down, the soil is going to shift, as I mentioned before, and so you get the heat release and the air injection that happens when you till, so that but you're not so much compacting the soil. There's a slight compaction over time, but it's not nearly as bad as when you till. It can be shaped to eliminate bending over, more space in a given area, and that's. So I guess I'll get into what forest gardening is. Can anyone give me their sort of idea of what that would be? No? Okay, so, yes? Yes. Generally, forest garden combines an orchard with a vegetable garden and an herb garden all in one space, as well as, people sometimes get into growing fiber, fuel, and fodder. Fuel would be sort of wood for a wood stove. So essentially, with a forest garden, you do a lot of what's called layering or stacking functions. Where's that? So instead of having a block orchard over here, and then my vegetable garden here, and then my herbs over here, you would kind of incorporate them all together. So say this is south. So you've got your sun exposure from that end. On the north end, you would have tall trees like nut trees, or whatever your tallest plant is going to be. So let's say that's a walnut tree. And the tallest go at the north end so that they're not shading anything out, unless you want to create shade. So maybe in the shade here I could have some mushroom logs, let's say. And then as you get further south, you would want to go into your shorter trees, so maybe an apple tree, and then maybe a peach tree kept as a bush, and then maybe a blueberry bush there, and then here you would get into your vegetables and that sort of thing. You can mix the layers. You could grow a grapevine up a fruit tree. You could grow sort of lettuce behind some of your trees so that they can benefit from the shade. Basically there are 7 layers. You've got your upper canopy. Should I write this out or? Sorry, it's really hard to do without the PowerPoint. Yeah, you've got your upper canopy trees, your lower canopy trees, your bush layer, your ground cover layer, your kind of vine layer, your herbaceous layer, so that would be any kind of vegetable plant, let's say, and then your root layer, anything that yields from the root zone. Am I missing, Mike, am I? Okay, I thought so. And yeah, as much as possible you want to mix all of that so that you sort of spread everything out so that if you get a pest outbreak that's attacking your apples, they're not all in one spot. The more that you can make your pests have to move around, the less time that wastes more of their time and more of their energy, so they can't do as much damage. Let's see, what else about forest gardening? I guess I'll sort of give you an the example of what we're doing with our forest garden. Essentially, we have a south-facing slope, and we're creating what's called a sun trap, where if I'm looking bird's eye view at the garden, so this is looking straight down on it. Here's south. So what we're trying to do is create a U-shaped tree line to sort of trap the sun, to block the wind. So essentially, our trees are going to be in that shape, so that it still allows all the sun to penetrate, and we're blocking. A lot of our winds come from the west and from the north. We do get some strong storms coming in from the east as well, so it's good to have that protection. And then we're slowly incorporating the odd tree spaced about 2 to 3 times the recommended distance, so that we still allow a lot of light in between these pockets, or in between the trees, so that we can still grow our tomatoes and other sun-loving plants. Around each tree, we are growing a variety of plants, and in some cases, I'm letting nature plant for me. And that's a really good thing if you have enough space and you can afford to, see what would naturally grow there, or what is naturally growing there. Learn about it if you can, identify it, see if it's useful in some way to you or to your plants. In a lot of cases, all that plant is trying to do, that weed that you don't want, it's just trying to either build fertility, or it's going to ward off some pest or attract pollinators for you. So I urge you to consider, learning about the plants that are growing naturally in your garden, and often you can use them. A good example of that for us would be something called lamb's quarters or wild spinach. That's a common one that comes up in horse manure. And it's a really awesome plant, very powerful. It's very tasty, as the name would suggest. It does taste a lot like spinach. One of our volunteers actually had some and was like, wow, this tastes more like spinach than spinach does. It's got like many times more nutrients and minerals, and it makes a great pesto. It's also a what do you call it? An indicator species. It can tell you if your soil is lacking phosphorus. It's got if it is lacking phosphorus, the underside of the leaves will grow purple and kind of dusty. So that can tell you a bit about your soil. A lot of plants will do that actually. Mullein, which I saw a lot of driving on the way up here, is it's also called cowboy toilet paper or something like that. It's a very soft, velvety leaf plant, very like elephant ear kind of plant. It will tell you that your soil is probably very nutrient poor or very compacted, or both. I'm trying to think of how to describe it. It grows it grows like a 4 to 6 to 8 foot long stalk that will overwinter. It'll sort of turn brown and look almost like a mini torch. And actually, you can use them for torches.
Is it similar to a bulrush?
Sorry?
Is it similar to a bulrush?
No. And it's got, tiny yellow flowers. You'll see mullein tea in some places. Oh, really? Oh, wow, that's amazing. So what was I saying about mullein? Oh, mullein, is sort of a plant that pops up in very nutrient poor sites, in general. Let me think of another one. Yeah. Okay, mullein is on page 40 if you have the Richter's catalog. That plant is a really good plant for, like I said, tea. You could make a torch out of it. It's also, if you're in a pinch, you can use it for toilet paper. It isn't edible. The leaf is edible. It's just not very palatable. It doesn't taste that great. But if you're, lost in the wilderness, it will keep you sustained. You can also, the best use I've found it for my uses is as pest control. Mullein has, I don't know if it's a toxin, some kind of compound in it that has been used as a fish poison, but I use it in my garden to ward off pests. I've only used it minimally, so I don't know conclusively if it works, but how I used it was I picked the leaves, I just dried them on a rack, and then I laid them out. Actually, you don't even need to dry them. You can just lay them out on your garden fresh and they'll dry naturally. I laid them out around plants that were having pest problems. So say I had something eating my nasturtiums, I would have a thick border around the nasturtiums of these mullein leaves. And my problem was my beans were getting just totally destroyed. Laid out these mullein leaves, and within a week there was no predation on their leaves at all. I was totally amazed. It saved our bean crops. So also with our pepper crop, our pepper plants were getting eaten by something, and again laid out the mullein leaves, worked really well. So, and that was a plant that most farmers would rip out and throw away, whereas it was coming up here and there. I thought, how can I use this to my advantage? So there's a bit of a mind shift that takes place with a lot of permaculturists. Some people say, they're just lazy and they don't want to bother, taking care of these things. But yes.
Did you use just the leaves without drying them?
At first I was drying them, but then I thought, well, why would I go to the trouble? Why don't I just lay them on the ground and let the sun do it for me?
Something eats my beans every year, and I don't know. I never have beans.
Yeah.
I'm going to try that.
Yeah, I'd urge you to give it a try.
Slugs or earwigs or rabbits eating them.
Yeah.
So,
probably our problem was slugs, I think.
They eat the seedling when it just comes up. Do you think
it's
a pest or?
Probably slugs, I would think.
It's the same with flower seedlings. I'm going to try that on flower seedlings as well.
Yeah.
Because they just don't make it past the inch stage.
Oh, geez.
So,
With beans, I don't know if you've found this or tried this, but if you cut a bean plant back after it's grown and give you a crop, it will regrow as long as it's healthy enough. When we had that first attack on our beans, they were down to the nub. They were a little stick. But I was like, okay, there's a bud there, so I'm gonna let it grow back, and it did. If you're worried with the mullein or other plants like that about it being unsightly, that's when you would take it somewhere else, dry it, and then you can sprinkle it so you can barely even see it. If you're worried about aesthetics. Let's see. Other plants that we've made use of. Well, burdock would be one. Burdock is a great plant, again, one that comes up in manure a lot, which is typical of gardens. Most parts of it, I think all parts are edible. The root is generally the part that's eaten, but even the flower stalk, when it's still bendable, when it's before the, at the budding stage, so before the flowers bloom, you can take the stalk, peel off the green part, and eat the white inner pit. I've actually sold that and a lot of other wild edibles to restaurants. Traditionally, they used to make a candy out of the inner pit. You can eat the flowers and the flower buds too, but they're not that great. So what burdock is good at doing is having a deep taproot that pulls up nutrients. That's what do they call this? Dynamic accumulator plant. So it's taking nutrients from way down below, bringing it up into its leaves. You can take those leaves to another spot that you want the fertility to go to, and just lay them out. Use them as a mulch. They're very big leaves, probably about kind of that big across. So they cover a lot of ground per leaf, and they won't last too long, but they will give you a little bit of relief from weeds. You can make medicine out of them. I think it's a blood cleanser. The root tastes a bit like a cross between, I don't know, I'd say a cross between a carrot and a parsnip, roughly, with a little bit of a nutty flavor. So that plant came up like crazy when we laid out our horse manure, and instead of weeding it for the most part, I just kept picking the leaves. So it's basically acting as a nutrient pump. Another thing is, if you let the leaves on the plant, they will sweat out moisture. So a good thing to do in a garden is to combine fine leaf plants in the same bed as broadleaf plants. So the fine leaf plants, like let's say a carrot or a fennel, will benefit from the moisture that's sweated out of the broadleaf plants, like a Swiss chard or a burdock. Nitrogen fixing plants are great to have in the garden as long as you keep them under control. Let's say, all the clovers, alfalfa, trefoils, they can get a little bit rampant. They tend to grow on stolons, which are sort of underground stems. And so it's good to either mow them or kind of hack them back with a machete or something like that periodically. And then you can use those trimmings in another spot, or just let them lay and rot in the ground. That's one key difference with a lot of permaculturists, is they don't tend to compost too much. Well, I should say have a separate compost pile from the garden. They do what's called composting in place. So as I said, when I'm doing my weeding, I almost always just let the plant lie where it was. Sometimes I'll even cover that up so that the sun doesn't bake the nutrients away. But when it just avoids the whole hassle of gathering up all the weeds, putting them in a wheelbarrow, taking them off site to a compost pile, and then all of the things that go with turning and measuring temperature and worrying about, oh, why is it smelly? You don't need to worry about any of that if you just compost in place, and it tends to keep the nutrients, or at least most of them, in the garden where they were meant to be anyways. My presentation on NoTill. Are there any other questions?
Where is your
So our farm, we're called Greenshire Eco Farms, and what's that? Sure, yeah. I don't know if you'll be able to read my writing, but and we do have a website, greenshireecofarms.com. And there's a pretty good spread of information of what we're doing at the farm. We are, as I said, a co-op, so we are always open to accepting new members and those who are interested. We have a YouTube channel as well. Just the same name, just look it up on YouTube, and we have a lot of videos of garden tours. Yes?
Do you have little tours, or if we wanted to come up and see your setup, can we do so?
Yep.
By calling you, or?
Yeah, email us or call us. Our contact info is on the website. Basically, in general, we have Sundays open for tours. But we are willing to do, custom days if it's set up.
And do you also do any farming, gardening over the winter, or is it strictly only spring, summer, and fall?
We do, we have that greenhouse that I talked about, so we're overwintering kale and green onions in there, but that's a small scale. We do cold frames, so it's like about the size of this table box with a window over top of it that we don't fully overwinter, but we do get, we can grow arugula into December and start it in March, that kind of thing. We also use floating row covers, which you can get at most hardware stores, or at least I've seen them at Canadian Tire. They're also called Remay, or just frost blankets. Oh, you do? Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, that's an awesome product. Unfortunately, it's a plastic, I think, but I think it is worth its weight in how long you can extend the season for. We get an extra probably 6 weeks of growing because of those frost blankets. And I also grow what are called microgreens under lights. We go to the Peterborough market with that. Yesterday was my first day at the market, and so that's when you grow. It's almost like sprouts, but you're growing them in soil under lights or sunlight with about 2 weeks of growth, whereas sprouts is usually just watered once a day, grown in the air in a bucket or jar, and grown for about 3 to 5 days. Well, we do have ponds, but we don't. For irrigation, we draw from our well. We have a high water table and a deep well, but we only have to water when we have had about 5 weeks with no rain is generally when I'll start watering, except for when I'm doing seedling plantings. At that point, I will water the seeds just to get them germinated and started. They do need a hot, wet microclimate, and what we've done is we planted them in our hugelkultur beds so that they have a good amount of moisture to draw from, and they have the heat from the bed. They're on a south-facing slope, so when you have a flat surface and the sun hitting it, when you have an angled surface to the sun, facing it, more of that surface area gets more sun exposure and it stays warmer longer, as opposed to a north-facing slope. We also planted a few of them around our pond, so that it benefits from the heat that's stored in the pond. So that's and the sun reflection as well, bouncing off the water. Yeah. In our experience, they do really well around the pond, yeah. They even do better than around the hugel culture.
What other fruit trees then do well around the pond?
I mean, we have cherry, apple, peach, and nectarine planted around our pond. And they all, well, actually the apple didn't do so well, but that was due to an insect attack. But before that, it was growing really well. I would imagine that just about any fruit tree would do quite well around a pond.
Do you prefer planting individually, like sporadic, or do you plant like 3 of a kind together and then another 2 or 3 of a kind?
As much as I can, I mix up the plantings, but you do want to take into account pollination. I think generally 50 feet is a good maximum distance, is the recommended maximum distance for, say, 2 apple trees to be apart. But I know other farmers and gardeners who will have 1 apple tree with a wild apple that's like 300 feet away, and they find that their pollination is fine. Yes?
Do you have open garden dates, or are you just open every Sunday to the public, or do you have to call them?
For any other day other than Sunday, you have to call ahead.
Come up on a Sunday anytime? Any Sunday?
I'm trying to think of our hours. I think from 10 o'clock till 5.
You can come up any Sunday then from 10 to 5.
From April till October, I believe. The information's on our website, for sure.
Without an appointment.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yes?
Do you use the tree gardening method for your orchard, like the forest gardening for your orchard?
Yeah.
Layers? And if so, then what do you recommend, say, for apple trees in an apple orchard for your 7 layers?
Okay, so if you already have a pre-existing, like an apple orchard that...
Or you already start one?
Right. Well, let's see. There's many ways to go about that. Really, herbs is the first thing that steps to my mind. Is plant as many different types of herbs as possible. I mean, focusing on what you're going to use, right? Of course, but chives, for instance, is a really, really good one. I think it battles apple scab, which is this sort of growth that can get on your apples, and it wards off pests. Horseradish is another one, and off the top of my head I can't remember what it does, but I do recall some website where this orchardist was having problems with their pear tree. Something was attacking it. Yeah, Mike?
There's an excellent book that's just come out in terms of how you do exactly what you're describing. It's the author's name is Michael Phillips, and the title is Holistic Orchards.
Holistic Orchards by... Oh, yeah, I have that one.
Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, Holistic Orchards by Michael Phillips. It's a really good book. I'm just starting to get into it, but it's amazing so far. And he's very much permaculture minded. So as far as the other layers, a currant bush, like a currant or gooseberry, would be good to plant on the north or the shady side of a fruit tree. Grapes will grow nicely up a fruit tree, but I've heard that you can get into problems with them crowding the tree out a little bit, and in some cases bending the tree over. I mean, we have wild grapes growing in our poplar forest, and a lot of the trees are bent right over. So it's something you just have to keep on top of in terms of pruning the grape. Or growing a poplar tree right next to your fruit tree, close enough, far enough away so that they're not competing, but close enough so that, how do I say this, so that it's not taking up too much room between. And you can always prune the poplar tree back if it gets too crazy. Let's see. Trying to think of the other layers. For root crops and that around fruit trees, you want to make sure that if you're going to be doing any digging, that they're as far away as possible so that you're not, smacking into the roots with your shovel. So definitely beyond the drip line, and by drip line I mean the the branch's edge, and the mature tree's branch edge. So even if you have this small tree that's only this big, envision how wide its branches are going to reach when it's mature. Usually, 5 to 7 feet for semi-standards, I think. And then try to put your root crops around that edge. Another good plant around fruit trees is comfrey. It does get kind of, it can get out of control, but it's a really good dynamic accumulator plant for pulling those nutrients up from way down. You can cut it back 2 to 4 times a year, and it will keep growing back and give you mulch. It's also a really good medicine. Anything with umbel flowers, so parsley, carrot, dill, and parsnip. Those are good plants to have around and let them flower and leave the flower stalks. They're really good at attracting like parasitic wasps, which help you out, and of course pollinators. And a lot of them taste really good. Trying to think of if I've missed any layers. So the currant bush would be the bush layer. To have a windbreak around the orchard, I think, is really important. But you want to balance that. You want some airflow, but you don't want these winds blasting your trees half over. There's Omafra has good information on specifics in terms of planting a windbreak around an orchard and how far they should be. I know that they recommend no more than 2 rows of trees if you're doing evergreens. I think it's 3 feet apart, but then you thin every other tree out once they start to crowd each other. And then that would be something that you could grow your grapes up, for instance, if you don't want to put that poplar tree in or what have you. Elderberries, yeah, great shade-tolerant fruit bush. So that would be another one to pop in there. Yeah, I think that would fairly well cover it. And then on the sunny side of any fruit tree, you can plant just about any vegetable as long as you have enough, fertility around there. We plant, cauliflower, celery, strawberries. Strawberries is a great ground cover to put around fruit trees. Raspberry canes would be okay, but they might eventually take over if you're not going to manage it very often.
You were mentioning your Korean pines. What were you planting around them? Or?
Nothing's planted around our Korean pines just yet. They're only about that tall. When we planted them, they've tripled in size. But what we did was we just put a thick mulch of pine needles. We have a pine plantation that was planted on our property probably 30 years ago, and so we just put that down to suppress the weeds and create acidity. As to what you would plant near pines, we've planted all manner of vegetables around mature pine trees, and they've almost all done well. We planted blueberries on the south side of our pine trees, and they did all right. They suffered, but that was because of the drought. Before the drought we had this past year, they were doing amazing, and I think that's partially because of the acidity from the pine needles. I think if you're in a wet area with pines, cranberries would be another one to consider. But yeah, things that enjoy the high acidity for sure. So the question was about what inoculant would you put when planting a pine tree. What we did was we just took soil and part of the organic matter layer from our pine forest and put that in the bottom of the planting hole, watered it, and then the theory is that all of the soil, building organisms and fungi that are inherent in that will spread into the surrounding area and latch onto the roots, if that's what they're going to do, of our Korean pine. Yeah? My favorite is white clover because it doesn't really grow very tall. But I tend to be lazy about nitrogen fixers, and we have a lot of them growing in our hay fields, so they will naturally just come into a site that we've disturbed for the most part, which tends to be red clover or trefoil. What's another good one? I can't think of any other. Alfalfa is pretty good as well. It doesn't grow too tall. But yeah, just really any nitrogen fixer I would think would be a good option. Yes? She's asking about spreading seed mixes, just scattering them on the ground. I've done that with hit and miss success. I did a mix of green onions, beets, and mustard, and a few others. Bok choy, baby bok choy, and that worked out really well actually. I think the key is to have the majority of your seed mix to be things that will grow fast and mature quickly, like say lettuce, and then to have a small portion to be those long-standing crops that are going to take 90 to 100 days. So the idea is you scatter your seeds and kind of scuff the ground. I actually didn't. I just rubbed my hand around the bed afterwards. You want to watch out that you don't. I've had problems where the seeds all germinated really thickly in one spot and hardly any in another. Some people use a rake to more evenly distribute the seeds. What else is another? And you want to keep up on the harvesting because otherwise the plants are going to crowd each other out very quickly. Where did I'm trying to think of another example. That was the best example that I had. The bok choy really liked it, and the green onions as well. And they take 30 days or 40 days, and then they're out of there. And the plants like the beets and Swiss chard and that can mature.
Did you cover the seeds with the sand or clay or something?
I did that. When I was mixing my seeds together, I threw hay or soil in and wetted it a bit, but that didn't really germinate well for me. I'm not sure why. Maybe things were too deep, or well, I don't think they stuck with each other because I only added a very little amount of water and the mix was very loose with the soil, so I don't think that was the problem. I think they probably just dried out, but I don't know for sure. Sep, what he recommends is a really wide variety of seeds, and he'll add nitrogen fixers in, he'll add root plants in, things that like to grow tall above ground. He really likes he'll add in a few poisonous plants even, and broadleaf plants, thinleaf plants, plants that are medicinal, he'll add in herbs. He tries for a really wide variety, and his theory is that the more you can mix that up with plants that require different nutrients and water levels, the less you're going to leach out from the garden area. If you have nothing but corn, it's going to suck up everything that corn needs, and next year it's going to suck for corn. But if you have 100 plants in that spot, that have very different nutrient and water needs, etc., it's less likely that you're going to deplete the soil.
But that's not true here that the plants should connect with each other, right? Because some plants can
Yeah, you're trying to create those beneficial relationships between the plants, the guilds. Guild being a group of plants that help each other out, or at least are neutral.
or if it's mixed, it doesn't matter what kind of seeds they are.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but if it's mixed, there's a lot. You have a lot better success rate, I would think.
Mitch, you mentioned a lot of great produce that Greenshire Farm produces on your property. Do you have a market for people to visit, or is it pretty much is it CAS or CSA program or anything like that that's going on there?
In the past, we've done CSA, so a food box program, a weekly food box program in season. But we're steering away from that. It was for the people power that we have. It just was too much in terms of getting the boxes and ready and organizing everything for delivery. It was too much of a hassle for us. So what I'm going to go more towards doing is growing for other people's CSAs and let them worry about the logistics.
Or farmers market? Do you do that?
Well, I'm in the Peterborough Farmers Market, but right now I'm only allowed to sell microgreens because they have a lot of vegetable growers. I'm going to be growing, hopefully providing a lot of wild edibles to the farmers market, like fiddleheads, wild leeks, wild ginger, the lamb's quarters, elderberry, I think, and a few others. I'm not sure we'll be able to grow vegetables. Maybe the odd one that, like, I know we do really good celery, and it's hard to find celery around our area. Different herbs that I'm going to have to find out what other farmers have in terms of herbs, and then provide what they're not. I'm big on filling in the gaps in a community, the vacuums. You know, why would I grow corn and wheat when everyone else is doing it? Why not try for things that people want but don't have a ready supply for? We sell to restaurants, both in Toronto and in Peterborough and Lindsay. And we will be putting in a roadside stand, or at least that's the plan this year. We've got a good secondary highway on the way to Bobcaygeon and to the Muskokas, so we get a lot of cottage traffic. And we've had a few people come to the farm and they want to pick their own vegetables or walk with me, and you know, they're like, oh, I'd like some of that. Can you get some for me? So we do that as well, like on the tours, if people want to buy food as we walk around. That works as well. And we sell to a local distributor called Kawartha Ecological Growers, which is also split into Grassroot Organics. They're out of Woodville, and we sell to them, and they go to Toronto markets. We tried the Bobcaygeon market. It was a new market at that time, and just there wasn't enough of a demand for what we were providing. Any other questions? Sure.
Do you have a good source for perennial vegetables, like plants?
Good source for perennial vegetables. Well, this place is a pretty great one. Off the top of my head, otherwise, a friend. There's a website out of Europe, but they do ship to Canada. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but they have hundreds of varieties of perennial vegetables. If you emailed me, just find the website and their email address and ask that question. I'll be able to get you that information. Yes? I do consultations, yeah. I've done about 4 or 5 so far. Some mostly on site, like I'll go to their place, and even home scale. I've done a consultation in an urban lot in Toronto. And I've also had people come to my farm and sort of check out what we're doing and pick my brain, and then we sort of go over a general plan of what they want to do at their place.
And how would you go about doing that? Would it be come to your place first?
It's really whatever the client wants.
And when would you start that procedure? Like now, before the spring?
Ideally, yeah. The more buffer of time you have between now and getting started, the better, because you can have a plan, but there's I always say you've got a plan that's great, but it's probably wrong. So the more you can sit with the plan and mill it over and look at it from different angles, I think the better chance you have of finding the holes in the plan. So
just email you for that?
Yep. Just shoot us an email and we'll go from there. Any other questions?
Well, go ahead. No, I was going to wrap it up, but go ahead.
Gray water. Do you guys do any gray water systems there? It sounds like you have a lot of water.
We have a gravel. It's a pretty crude gray water gravel system for our addition and shower water out of the one house. The other house, the main house that was there before, was already hooked up to a septic. Eventually, what we'd like to do is get a constructed wetland. Our municipality is pretty old school with the gray water and constructed wetland idea, and so they're really reluctant to have anyone go that route. So we're going to have to fight tooth and nail if we want to get there. Fleming College out of Lindsay is we're going to partner with them, and they're willing to sort of fight for us and make the case and bring in their expertise in history and research. So hopefully we will get a constructed wetland, but I imagine it's going to be quite the hassle.
Well, with that, I would like to thank Travis very much for this incredible lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At Richter's, it's not just a garden, it's a whole new world. For herb plants, seeds, veggies, and more, visit us at richters.com or call 1-800-668-4372.